Lost in the wilderness, a lonely baby deer crosses paths with a stranded hiker. What happens next will leave you speechless. Together, they embark on a journey of survival, trust, and an unexpected bond that proves kindness can change everything. Don't miss their incredible story. The golden hues of autumn painted the forest in a soft, warm glow, but the beauty of the landscape couldn't mask the growing chill in the air. Liam, a young and adventurous hiker, trudged through the dense woods, his boots crunching against the scattered leaves below. He had planned this hike as a chance to escape the chaos of daily life, to find peace among the towering trees and whispering winds. But as the day wore on, he realized he had wandered too far off the trail. The once calming stillness of the forest now felt heavy, almost suffocating as he glanced around, trying to orient himself. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. Liam's heartbeat quickened as he checked his phone. Dead. His map crumpled in his pocket was no use now, and the trail markers he thought he'd been following were nowhere in sight. Lost and alone, a creeping sense of unease settled in his chest. Unbeknownst to Liam, he wasn't the only one struggling to find his way that day. Just a short distance away, hidden among the trees, a tiny, trembling fawn was also wandering alone. Her cries, soft but heartbreaking, echoed faintly through the forest, carried by the crisp evening air. She was barely old enough to stand on her own, let alone survive without her mother, who was nowhere to be found. The little fawn stumbled over the uneven ground, her wide, frightened eyes searching for something, anything, that might offer safety. As the forest grew darker, fate was about to bring these two lost souls together. What began as a fight for survival would soon become a journey of unexpected friendship, one that would touch them both in ways they could never have imagined. Deep in the heart of the forest, the tiny fawn stumbled clumsily over the uneven ground, her legs shaking with every step. She let out a soft, pitiful cry, her voice barely rising above the rustling leaves around her. Her fur, a beautiful patchwork of brown and white spots, was damp from the morning dew, and her fragile body looked too small for the vast wilderness that surrounded her. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that made the forest seem even more intimidating. The fawn had been wandering alone for hours, and with every faltering step, her strength seemed to wane. She stopped frequently, her head swiveling as if searching for her mother, her ears twitching at every small sound. But there was nothing, no reassuring presence, no familiar scent, only the cold realization that she was utterly alone. Her mother was gone, and she didn't understand why. Perhaps it had been a predator, or maybe her mother had been injured or scared away. All the fawn knew was that the warm, comforting presence that had always guided her was no longer there. Now, the forest, once her home, felt vast and unkind, a maze of towering trees and shifting shadows. As the evening wore on, the air grew colder, and the fawn's cries became weaker, her tiny body beginning to succumb to exhaustion. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto a patch of leaves, her breaths coming in shallow, rapid bursts. The forest, indifferent to her plight, pressed on with its endless rustling and chirping. For the first time in her short life, the fawn had no one to turn to, no one to protect her. Yet, even in her fragile state, she didn't give up. She struggled back to her feet, driven by some instinctual will to survive. Her cries echoed faintly through the trees, carrying a quiet desperation that seemed to plead for help. Somewhere, out there in the forest, was a glimmer of hope. She just didn't know it yet. Liam wiped the sweat from his brow as he glanced up at the towering trees around him. Their branches stretched high into the sky, forming a canopy that made it nearly impossible to track the sun's position. The deeper he ventured into the forest, the more disoriented he became. His once confident strides slowed to hesitant steps as he tried to retrace his path, but everything looked the same. Endless trees and fallen leaves, with no clear sign of the trail he had been following. He pulled his phone from his pocket, hoping the GPS might help, but his stomach sank as the screen remained black. The battery had died hours ago. A faint frustration bubbled up, but it was quickly replaced by a growing sense of unease. He had told himself this hike would be an adventure, a chance to disconnect from the world. But now, as the forest grew quieter and the shadows stretched longer, adventure felt more like isolation. Liam paused and took a deep breath, trying to focus. He unfolded a crumpled map from his backpack, but the network of trails and landmarks on the paper only added to his confusion. How did I miss the markers? He muttered to himself, scanning his surroundings. His heart began to race as the realization sank in. He was lost. The distant sound of rustling leaves made him freeze. He turned sharply, hoping to see someone, anyone on the trail. But there was no one. The forest had swallowed him whole, its stillness now eerily loud. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent. The quiet felt oppressive, and for the first time, Liam felt the weight of being completely alone. He pressed forward, trying to find something familiar, a tree he'd passed earlier, a rock formation, but nothing clicked. The sun was beginning to dip lower, the golden hues of late afternoon turning darker by the minute. He knew he had limited time before nightfall, and with no supplies to make a fire or shelter, the forest suddenly felt a lot less inviting. As he trudged through the thick underbrush, Liam heard a sound, a faint, high-pitched cry that stopped him in his tracks. He strained to listen, his ears tuned to the soft whimper that echoed faintly through the trees. It wasn't the sound of wind or rustling leaves. It was different, almost like an animal. Curiosity and instinct replaced his panic, and Liam changed direction, following the sound deeper into the forest. With every step, the cries grew louder, tugging at him like an invisible string. He didn't know what he'd find, but something inside him told him to keep going. Little did he know, he wasn't just following the sound of a creature in need. He was walking straight into an encounter that would change his life forever. The faint cries grew louder as Liam pushed through the thick underbrush, each step bringing him closer to the source. His heart raced, not from fear, but from an inexplicable pull, as though something was guiding him toward whatever was in distress. The forest around him seemed to close in, the towering trees casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower. The cries were soft but filled with pain, cutting through the stillness of the woods like a fragile thread holding on for dear life. Finally, Liam stepped into a small clearing, and there, beneath the shelter of a large oak tree, he saw her. A tiny fawn, curled up on the forest floor. Her spotted coat blended with the fallen leaves, but her wide, terrified eyes locked onto him immediately. She was trembling, her thin legs tucked under her fragile body as though she'd been lying there for hours, too weak to move. Her soft cries echoed again, a desperate plea for help. Liam froze, unsure of what to do. He had never been this close to a wild animal before, let alone one in such obvious distress. The fawn didn't move, her little chest rising and falling rapidly as she stared at him. She was clearly frightened, but there was no strength left in her to run. Liam took a cautious step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, little one, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The fawn let out another soft whimper, her ears twitching at the sound of his voice. She didn't flinch as Liam knelt down, inching closer. He could see now how small and frail she was, her ribs visible beneath her thin coat, her legs trembling even though she wasn't trying to stand. She looked up at him, her big, glossy eyes filled with fear, and something else, trust. Liam felt his chest tighten. She wasn't just an animal, she was a baby, lost and alone, without her mother to protect her. Her cries weren't just sounds, they were calls for help, and Liam knew he couldn't ignore them. "What happened to you?" he murmured, his voice soft and filled with compassion. He carefully reached into his backpack and pulled out a water bottle. Unscrewing the cap, he tilted it slowly, letting a few drops trickle into his hand. The fawn hesitated, her little nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Then, with slow, cautious movements, she leaned forward and licked the water from his palm. Liam smiled faintly, his heart swelling as he watched her. "There you go. You're okay now." As he sat there, crouched in the fading light of the forest, Liam realized he couldn't leave her. She was too weak to survive on her own, and the forest was no place for a fawn without her mother. In that moment, an unspoken bond formed between them, a connection born from shared vulnerability. Liam wasn't sure how he would help her, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't let her face the forest alone. The forest seemed quieter now, as though it too was holding its breath. Liam gently reached out his hand, and the fawn didn't resist as he carefully scooped her into his arms. Her small body was light, her head resting against his chest, as though she had already decided to trust him. With the sun disappearing behind the trees, Liam stood and began walking, carrying the little fawn with him. Neither of them knew where the journey would lead, but they both knew they had found something they needed: each other. Liam held the tiny fawn in his arms, her fragile body trembling against him as she rested her head on his chest. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, seemed to plead with him for safety. He felt the weight of her vulnerability, the fragility of life cradled in his hands. The forest around them was growing darker by the minute, the faint hues of sunlight fading into the cool tones of twilight. He knew he couldn't stay there for long, but the question loomed large in his mind: what was he supposed to do? The fawn was clearly exhausted, her breaths shallow and uneven. Every so often, she let out a soft, pitiful cry that tugged at Liam's heart. He glanced around the forest, hoping against hope to see signs of her mother or another deer nearby, but there was nothing, just the endless expanse of trees and shadows. She was alone, just like him. "You can't survive out here on your own," Liam murmured, as if the fawn could understand him. "But I don't even know if I can help you." The weight of the situation began to settle in. Liam was lost, with no idea how far he was from the trail or even the nearest road. His phone was dead, his supplies were limited, and now he had a baby deer depending on him for survival. His rational side screamed at him to leave her behind, to focus on saving himself. But as he looked down at her, her small, delicate frame curled against his chest, he knew he couldn't do it. Every instinct told Liam to put his own safety first. But how could he walk away from a life so fragile, so dependent on him? The forest had tested him, and now it was giving him a choice: to leave her or to help her. Liam set the fawn down gently on the forest floor, crouching beside her. He rummaged through his backpack, pulling out the last of his water and an apple he had packed for the hike. He broke the apple into small pieces, holding one out to the fawn. She hesitated, her nose twitching as she sniffed the fruit, before cautiously taking a bite. Liam couldn't help but smile as she chewed slowly, her energy still too low to do much more. "You're tougher than you look," he said softly, "but you're not going to make it out here alone." The decision was no longer a question of if, it was a question of how. Liam gently picked the fawn back up, her small body fitting perfectly in his arms. She didn't resist, too weak to fight and seemingly resigned to his care. Her head rested against him, and for the first time her trembling seemed to ease. With the fawn cradled in his arms, Liam realized that this wasn't just about saving her. In a way, she was saving him too. She gave him a purpose, a reason to keep moving, even when the odds seemed impossible. As Liam adjusted his grip and began walking, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He didn't know how far they would have to go or how long it would take to find help, but he was determined to try. Together they would face the forest and its challenges, one step at a time. In that moment, Liam wasn't just a lost hiker, he was a lifeline for a creature who had no one else. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he had made his decision. He would help her, no matter what it took. With the fawn cradled in his arms, Liam stepped cautiously through the forest, the weight of her fragile body a constant reminder of her dependence on him. The woods had grown darker, the golden light of dusk fading into the cool blue of early evening. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot made Liam's heart jump. He didn't know where they were going, but one thing was certain: he couldn't stop now. The fawn, despite her frailty, seemed to trust him completely. Her head rested gently against his chest, her wide, innocent eyes half closed as exhaustion overtook her. Every so often she would let out a faint whimper, but Liam would whisper softly to her, his voice low and soothing. "It's okay, little one. I've got you. We'll find a way out of this." Though the words were meant for her, they gave Liam a strange sense of reassurance, too. The journey was anything but easy. Liam had to navigate through thick underbrush, uneven ground, and the occasional fallen tree. At one point, he came across a shallow stream that cut through their path. The water was icy cold, and the rocks beneath it were slick with moss. Carefully, he stepped onto the stones, clutching the fawn tightly. His foot slipped, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, he thought he might lose his balance. But he caught himself just in time, the fawn letting out a small cry of alarm as he steadied them both. The forest tested them at every turn, with its unpredictable terrain and unrelenting darkness. But with every step, Liam found a new resolve. He wasn't just walking for himself anymore. He was walking for her. As they pressed on, Liam began to notice small changes in the fawn. She no longer trembled as much, and her breathing had steadied. Though her energy was still low, there was a quiet strength in the way she clung to him, her trust in him unwavering. It was as though she understood that he was her only chance of survival. Liam paused to rest beneath a large tree, lowering himself carefully onto the ground. He placed the fawn beside him, pulling out the last of his water and offering her a drink. She lapped at the water from his cupped hand, her small tongue flicking gently. Liam smiled, the simple act of her drinking enough to renew his determination. He pulled an energy bar from his pocket, breaking off a piece and nibbling on it before offering her a bit of the apple he had saved. She took it hesitantly, her trust growing with each bite. As they rested, Liam found himself talking to the fawn as if she could understand him. "You know, I wasn't supposed to get lost today," he said with a faint chuckle. "This was just supposed to be a quick hike. Funny how things work out, huh?" The fawn blinked at him, her big eyes unblinking and full of quiet understanding. "Guess we both needed someone today." As the night deepened, the temperature began to drop, and Liam knew they couldn't stop for long. He adjusted his jacket, wrapping it around both himself and the fawn as they continued their journey. The stars began to peek through the gaps in the trees, their faint light providing a small measure of comfort. Every so often, Liam would pause to listen, hoping for the sound of a road or some sign of civilization. But the forest remained silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Despite the challenges, Liam felt a strange sense of purpose. The fawn's presence gave him a reason to keep moving, even when his legs ached and his breath came in shallow bursts. He wasn't just walking for himself anymore, he was walking for her, for the life that had been entrusted to him in the most unexpected way. In the quiet darkness of the forest, Liam and the fawn became a team. Every step was a challenge, every moment a test, but together they found a strength neither of them knew they had. As they moved through the woods, a bond began to form between them, one that went beyond words. The fawn's trust in Liam and his determination to protect her became the foundation of an unspoken friendship. And though the forest loomed large around them for the first time, neither of them felt completely alone. The journey was far from over, but in that moment, as Liam held the fawn close and whispered soft reassurances, he knew they had already found something precious: hope. Together, they pressed on, determined to find their way out of the darkness. As the night deepened, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to transform into an entirely different world. The shadows stretched longer, the faint light of the stars barely piercing through the thick canopy above. Liam's breaths came out in short, visible puffs, his legs aching with every step. He clutched the fawn tightly, her small body shivering against him, a reminder that they couldn't keep going much longer without rest. Just as exhaustion threatened to overtake him, Liam spotted something up ahead, a cluster of large trees whose roots arched out of the ground, creating a small, natural hollow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to shield them from the biting wind and give them a chance to recover. "We'll stop here," Liam whispered to the fawn, his voice soft but determined. "This will have to do for now." Carefully, he knelt down and set the fawn inside the hollow, her small body curling up instinctively as she sought warmth. She let out a faint, exhausted whimper, and Liam's chest tightened. He shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her, tucking it around her frail body to keep her warm. The cold air immediately bit into his skin, but he didn't care. She needed it more than he did. In the heart of the dark forest, with no supplies and no fire, Liam made the only choice he could, to give everything he had to the fragile life depending on him. Liam sat beside her, leaning against the tree as he tried to keep himself warm. He rummaged through his backpack, pulling out the last of his apple and offering a small piece to the fawn. She hesitated at first, then nibbled at it weakly, her trust in him growing with every bite. "That's it, little one," Liam said softly, a faint smile crossing his face. "You're stronger than you look." The wind howled through the trees, but the hollow provided some relief from the worst of it. The fawn, now calmer, nestled closer to Liam, her small head resting on his leg. He gently stroked her fur, feeling the rise and fall of her shallow breaths. "You're going to make it," he murmured, as much to reassure himself as her. "We both are." As Liam sat there in the quiet of the night, his thoughts wandered. He hadn't planned on getting lost, and he certainly hadn't expected to find himself caring for a helpless animal. But in this strange and unexpected journey, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. The fawn had given him a reason to keep going, to push past the fear and exhaustion. Under the shelter of the ancient tree, two lost souls found a moment of peace. The forest, once so vast and unforgiving, now felt smaller, less frightening, because they had each other. The hours stretched on, and the forest around them grew still. Liam could feel his eyelids growing heavy, but he refused to fall asleep completely. He stayed alert, his mind focused on keeping the fawn safe. The bond between them, though unspoken, was undeniable. She trusted him, and he wouldn't let her down. As the night wore on, the fawn's shivering finally stopped. Her breathing slowed, becoming deeper and steadier. Liam looked down at her, a sense of relief washing over him. For the first time since he'd found her, she seemed truly at peace. And for Liam, that was enough to keep him going. Though the challenges ahead were still uncertain, one thing was clear: they had made it through the night together. And in the heart of the forest, beneath the shelter of the tree, they had found something precious: hope, trust, and the quiet strength to keep moving forward. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, painting the forest in a soft golden glow, Liam slowly stood up, careful not to disturb the fawn who had finally settled into a deep, exhausted sleep. The night had been long, and though the cold still clung to the air, a sense of calm had settled in his chest. The fawn, nestled against his side, was warm and breathing more steadily, her trembling finally subsiding. Liam felt a small surge of hope. Maybe they could make it through this. But just as he was about to check on their progress, a distant sound broke the silence. The faint but unmistakable hum of voices reached his ears, growing louder as they approached. Liam's heart skipped a beat. Was it another hiker? A rescue team? He jumped to his feet, carefully scooping the fawn back into his arms, and began making his way toward the source of the sound. The forest around him was still thick, but the voices were now unmistakably closer. The anxiety that had been gnawing at him since he realized he was lost began to fade as he hurried toward the sound, the fawn's small body cradled against him. For the first time since the forest had swallowed him whole, Liam felt a glimmer of hope. The rescue team had arrived, but they weren't the only ones who had been waiting for help. As Liam emerged into a small clearing, he saw them, two figures in the distance, their bright jackets standing out against the dark green of the forest. They were scanning the area, calling out his name. "Liam! Liam! Can you hear us?" One of them shouted, their voice echoing through the trees. Liam's heart soared, and he waved his free hand above his head, shouting back, "Over here, I'm here." The figures rushed toward him, and within moments, two rescue workers emerged from the underbrush. They froze when they saw Liam, his arms wrapped protectively around the fawn. "You found her," one of the rescuers said, his voice filled with surprise and admiration. "How is she?" Liam smiled, though his face was tired and worn. "She's better. She's strong, but we've been through a lot." The rescue workers knelt down to assess the fawn, checking her vital signs, ensuring she was stable enough for transport. The fawn, still weak but no longer trembling, blinked up at them, her wide eyes filled with trust and relief. They gently placed her on a stretcher, making sure she was comfortable. As the fawn was carefully lifted onto the stretcher, Liam felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The journey had been long and uncertain, but in that moment, he knew he had made the right choice. He had given her a chance. Liam watched silently, his chest swelling with pride and relief. The fawn was finally going to be safe. She was in the hands of experts now, and soon she would be cared for, healed, and, most importantly, returned to the wild where she belonged. As the rescue team prepared to take the fawn back to their camp, Liam stood back, a quiet sense of fulfillment filling him. The night had been long, But in the end, he had found more than just survival. He had found a connection, a bond that would stay with him forever. Sometimes the path to survival isn't about fighting to the end. It's about making the choice to help, even when the odds are against you. And in helping another, you might just find the strength you didn't know you had. With one last look at the fawn, now on her way to recovery, Liam turned and walked back with the rescue team, knowing he had done something extraordinary, not just for the fawn, but for himself too. The rescue team led Liam and the fawn back through the forest, the tension in the air gradually lifting as they neared their camp. The journey back was easier, the path now clearer with the light of day fully breaking through the trees. The fawn, though still fragile, seemed to sense the shift. Her trembling had stopped, and she nestled more comfortably in the rescue workers' arms. Liam walked beside them, his steps slow but filled with purpose. By the time they reached the camp, a wildlife rehabilitation center nestled at the edge of the forest, the fawn had regained a small amount of strength. A team of specialists was waiting, ready to take over her care. The sight of the center, complete with warm facilities, medical equipment, and experienced hands, was a relief to Liam. He knew the fawn was in good hands, but leaving her behind felt bittersweet. At last, they had found safety. The forest that had once felt so vast and unforgiving had led them here, to a place of healing. But it wasn't just the fawn's journey that had come to an end, it was Liam's too. The wildlife experts gently placed the fawn into a large, soft enclosure where she would have plenty of space to rest and recover. The staff immediately began examining her, checking her vitals and making sure she had the food and care she needed. Liam stood back, his arms folded, his heart a mix of emotions. He'd given her a chance, but now he had to trust the experts to do the rest. A wildlife specialist turned to Liam with a warm smile. "You did the right thing. We'll take good care of her. She's got a long road ahead, but she's strong. She'll make it." Liam nodded, a sense of pride filling him. "I'm just glad I could help," he said, his voice steady but soft. The fawn's journey was far from over, but it was now a journey of recovery, not survival. The center would nurse her back to health, and one day, when the time was right, she would return to the wild, stronger, wiser, and ready to face the world again. Liam stayed for a little while longer, watching as the fawn settled into her new space, her wide eyes now calm and filled with trust. He could see the healing process begin, her small body starting to relax in the safety of her new home. The sounds of the forest seemed distant here, muted by the safety of the center, but the fawn didn't need the wild to survive anymore. She had found a sanctuary, and so had he. As Liam prepared to leave, he took one last look at the fawn. She was no longer just an animal he had rescued. She was a symbol of hope, of resilience, and the extraordinary bond that could exist between humans and nature. And so, the fawn's story didn't end with the forest. It began anew, in the hands of those who could help her grow strong again. For Liam, the journey had shown him more than survival. It had shown him the profound power of compassion and the unspoken connection that exists between all living things. With a final wave to the staff, Liam turned and walked away, the weight of his decision settling into his heart, knowing that, together, they had saved a life and changed his own in the process. The rescue team moved swiftly, ensuring that the fawn was safe and comfortable as they transported her to the nearby wildlife rehabilitation center. Liam walked alongside, his steps lighter now that the fawn was in good hands. He could see the team working carefully, monitoring her condition and making sure she was stabilized. There was no longer any panic in the air, only the calm assurance that she was being taken care of. When they arrived at the center, the staff wasted no time, gently placing the fawn in a spacious, cozy enclosure. It was filled with soft hay, fresh water, and the gentle hum of nature, everything she needed to recover. Liam stood back as the rehabilitation team got to work, checking the fawn's vitals and administering the care she so desperately needed. He felt a bittersweet pang in his chest as he watched them work. He had done everything he could for her, but now it was time to let her go. It wasn't easy, but Liam knew this was where she needed to be, safe, protected, and ready to eventually return to the wild. The fawn, now settled in her new home, looked up at Liam with those wide, trusting eyes, as though thanking him for all he had done. He gave her one last gentle pat before turning to leave. He knew it was the right decision, but the bond they had formed would stay with him forever. As the fawn settled into her new home, Liam couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had done more than just survive the forest. He had helped a life find a second chance, and in doing so, had found something greater within himself. As Liam made his way back through the forest, the sounds of the wildlife around him seemed to echo louder, more vibrant than before. He had helped a creature in need, and in the process, he had learned something profound. The forest, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had shown him the power of kindness, of connection, and the unexpected ways in which we find purpose. It wasn't just about survival in the wilderness. It was about the moments of connection, the choices we make when faced with challenges, and the quiet power of compassion. Liam had found not just a way out of the woods, but a deeper understanding of what it means to care for something beyond yourself. Liam's journey had been one of uncertainty, but it was also one of growth. He had entered the forest as a man lost in more ways than one, but he left with a sense of clarity, having made a difference in the life of a helpless fawn. And as he looked back at the forest one last time, he realized that sometimes the greatest adventures are the ones where we find our true purpose, not in the destination, but in the journey and the lives we touch along the way. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe for more incredible moments that show how kindness and compassion can change the world. Sometimes, the smallest acts of help can lead to the most extraordinary journeys.